is better than tapping into the giant brain down at American University of Professor Lawless for her weekly Skype in to tell us everything that's going on, not only in her giant brain, but also in the brain of the president. What is going on in Washington, D.C.? Let's start with, God, there's so many issues to talk about. Can we talk about tax reform just for a minute? Is this thing going anywhere? Are we going anywhere with tax reform?
Probably not. I think that the president has made it clear and the Republicans have made it clear that they need some sort of a win. And over the weekend, we saw, for example, Susan Collins say that she could imagine a scenario where she would vote for tax reform just because we haven't had an overhaul to the system in several decades. So some of the moderates that have been a problem or a thorn in Trump's side for issues like healthcare might come around. But then you've got people like Bob Corker or Rand Paul who say absolutely not. So, I think it's going to have a really hard time getting through. And it just might be that the 3 or 4 no votes are a different crop of people than we've been accustomed to seeing.
So when I went to work in the United States Senate in 1985, the next year was 86, and people like Bill Bradley, Democrat from New Jersey, and Bob Packwood, Republican for Oregon, and Republican John Chafee, they all teamed up together, John Breaux from Louisiana, sort of all this middle of the country politically got together and did the last sweeping change in tax structure, the 1986 tax reform. Is it ever going to be possible to get a couple Democrats to come over with a couple Republicans and put together something that can ever be adopted in the United States Senate anymore?
I think it's really unlikely. It's possible that we can identify 4 or 6 or 8 members of the Senate who might be willing to come together to draft something that's truly bipartisan.
Yeah.
We often hear about various conceptions of gangs of 8 who are willing to move forward in a bipartisan way. The problem is that the Democrats have moved further to the left and the Republicans have moved further to the right. So it's very, very difficult for the people that aren't part of that gang of 6 or 8 to support something that looks fundamentally different from what their preferences are. And so as we've seen increased polarization in the last 30 years, and particularly in the last 15 to 20, it makes those kinds of compromises almost impossible. And when I think about the kinds of people that you just named, all of them today would be Democrats.
John Chafee would never be a Democrat, in
terms of how he'd vote.
Yeah,
he'd vote
sure.
with the Democrats probably close to 100% of the time.
Yeah, absolutely.
So even if their party affiliation made them stand out, they would certainly not be beloved members of their own conference or caucus on Capitol Hill.
How do the Republicans explain at the midterm that they controlled the House, Senate, and the presidency and literally could not get a major piece of legislation through?
Well, the nice thing about it for the Republicans is that the American people are not rocket scientists. So if they say it enough times, and if the president says enough times, and he's already starting to say it, that the Democrats were the problem and the Democrats were holding things up, people are inclined to believe that. They tend not to know the exact margins in the House or the Senate. They tend not to know about congressional procedures and the circumstances under which you either do or don't need a filibuster. And I think it really comes down to the narrative. Now, the Democrats have a much easier message to convey, which is that the Republicans controlled everything and they couldn't get it done. They're blaming us. But I don't think that they should assume that the Republicans won't figure out a way to spin these outcomes as looking like the Democrats are at least in part to blame.
So I just want to stay on this for 1 second. Do the Democrats have a problem in that there is absolutely, best as I can tell, and unless you see otherwise, no emerging leader of the Democratic Party? I mean, we're a year after the election, and yes, Donald Trump is still criticizing Hillary Clinton, but Hillary Clinton is the most prominent member of the Democratic Party right now with her book tours and her, explanations of her defeat. At what point will the Democratic Party start to bring forward a new group of leaders to be able to articulate a Democratic message?
Yeah, it's a problem. I mean, I think Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi have emerged as the obvious
And
messengers.
what's their average age between the two of them?
Like 117.
Okay.
And so, I mean, the issue though is worse than that though. It's not only that they're sort of aging out and that there's no bench or next generation. It's also that, as far as Pelosi is concerned anyway, there's an explicit fight for control of the party. And on Meet the Press or on This Week, This Weekend, she said explicitly that she's not going anywhere. Healthcare is her legacy, and she's going to do everything she can to protect and improve the Affordable Care Act, despite the fact that there are other members of her own party, including women, saying, look, your time is up, we need change. And so that kind of infighting is something that Democrats certainly want to avoid heading into the next election cycle. But it isn't clear who the successor is. With Chuck Schumer, it's a little bit different because he's in a very, very safe seat. And so
Right.
he can be a liberal firebrand in a way where there's not much consequence.
Just to put her age in perspective, and I'm not going to out a person's name, but my peer friend's mother was her roommate in college. Okay, so that puts it in some level of perspective. At Trinity.
Look, that is perspective. She's not among the oldest members of the House or the Senate.
Is John?
But I mean, we do have this. There's this octogenarian feeling on Capitol Hill right now.
Is John Stennis still in the Senate? Let's jump over. 60 Minutes had about as good a 60-minute story as that news magazine has ever had. A very insightful piece about one of the efforts by Congress to undermine the DEA's work to get control of the opioid catastrophe that's literally killing tens of thousands of Americans. And it got tied up with members of Congress who had received massive amount of campaign donations from major healthcare companies. And bring it home to Rhode Island, Sheldon Whitehouse was one of those members of Congress on the Senate side who received it and worked for that reform, which is being tied to undermining DEA. What's the repercussions down in Washington for these members who are tied to that 60 Minutes investigation?
Well, I think it hurts Republicans a little bit more than it hurts Democrats for two reasons. The first is already we've seen the president come out and say that he was withdrawing the support for his initial nominee as drug czar. But beyond that, he wouldn't be supporting anybody who even 1% of the time did anything to undermine the DEA's efforts. And so the Republicans sort of have to take ownership of this issue because the president has made it such an important piece of his agenda. And the legislation was sponsored by Republicans as well, Orrin Hatch in the Senate, Reno in the House. The second reason that I think that it hurts Republicans a little bit more than it does Democrats is because the lion's share of the campaign contributions coming from pharmaceutical companies and from these distributors in particular tend to go to the Republicans. So it's not to say that Sheldon Whitehouse won't take some kind of hit, but broadly speaking, I don't think he's going to be the kind of person that really gets sort of hurt hard by this kind of investigation.
He's running a little bit of risk up here. I think, usually Democratic and incumbent senators are untouchable in Rhode Island, really until almost to the point that they retire in their 90s, whether it's T.F. Green or John Pastore or Claiborne Pell. But he's had a little bit of a run. Our investigation on his ties to an all-white summer beach club, Bailey's Beach. Then the sort of bizarre scenario, which got picked up by Axios, related to him and some other senators going over to the Kushner-Trump household for dinner, which just does not make a tremendous amount of sense to anybody. And now this one, those other ones are questionable. This one gets into that, Keating 5 kind of look and feel. When a group of United States senators called regulators in to berate the regulators on behalf of a major savings and loan empire in Arizona. Most of them were defeated or didn't run again. John McCain's really the only one that survived the Keating 5. How far does this go, or does the press corps switch back over to Russia or North Korea tomorrow?
Well, I think this probably has legs that last a little longer than some of these other things just because it's so important to the administration and it's something that they're going to continue to tout as a top agenda item.
Yeah.
What I would say is that as far as Sheldon Whitehouse is concerned, it's very unlikely in this political climate that Democratic senators are not going to be able to ride a Democratic wave in the next cycle. And so the biggest threat would be if a very serious primary opponent emerged and challenged him on these very types of things. Now, the question of whether all of these little strange instances, and this one, which is not so strange, it's just kind of unfortunate for him, add up to sufficient grounds, to put together a real challenge. That's a question. But I just don't see Republicans being able to take down Democrats this cycle who are representing pretty blue states.
Is this a year of D's versus R, or is this a year of, or a cycle of throw the bums out, where regardless of which party you're in, you run the risk of facing real voter distrust, upheaval, etc.?
I think we have the potential to see that kind of dynamic play out on both sides of the aisle in the primaries. I think by the time we get to the general election, it's always about D's and R's. So the question really becomes, are there quality candidates that are going to emerge that can take on some of these incumbents, especially in the Republican Party? We know Steve Bannon is going to fund and recruit a lot of them. On the Democratic side of the aisle, the party itself doesn't seem, and opponents to sort of the establishment, people like Bernie Sanders, for example, don't seem that invested in identifying insurgent candidates to throw the bums out.
Gotcha. Do you see the president's inability to get things done undermine, or in a strange way help Bannon recruit, fund, and push these disruptive, I don't want to call it Tea Party Part 2, but maybe it's Tea Party Part 2, candidates who Bannon makes the argument, you need to send them to Washington to help the president get things done?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky question. If it was 2020, Donald Trump would not want Steve Bannon making that argument because it would suggest that he's not an effective president. In a midterm, if the argument works and the Republicans are able to keep control of both chambers and they're able to have more Trump-friendly voices, that would be a great coup. I just think it's a really risky strategy.
It didn't work well in a lot of cases, especially in the United States Senate, for when the Tea Party knocked out some mainstream Republicans and replaced them with kind of fringe candidates who were not competitive in the general. Dick Lugar lost in a primary. I think there was a race down in Delaware in which the Republican...
Christine O'Donnell.
Yeah, that's right.
The candidate, right? And, you want to be the Democrat running against a Republican whose TV ads say, I am not a witch. Yeah. You wind up running the risk of these really fringe candidates who don't have the discipline to make it through a general election. Sharon Angle in 2010 was the reason that Harry Reid was able to hold on to his seat.
Right. So could the Republicans shoot themselves in the foot and create a bunch of scenarios like this where they win the primaries? I mean, that Alabama seat's going to go red no matter what, but in a lot of states, they don't have that luxury and that differentiation in what the electorate's going to do. So in the states that are purple, and they replace mainstream Republicans, Kentucky's a great example. If Mitch McConnell was up this cycle, which he's not, but if he was up and they almost, they primaried him last time, and then he had a tough general election, could those kinds of seats, even a red state like Kentucky, could those be in play in 2018?
They could be, but in order for them to be in play, the Democrats have to be really, really disciplined, and they can't make any mistakes.
Yeah.
But sure, running against a crackpot is a lot easier than running against an establishment incumbent.
Is that your side political consulting business? Is that the advice you give to your candidates? Run against crackpots. Find the crackpot, run against them.
As somebody that was initially considered a crackpot, I'm a little bit cautious.
Let's shift over to healthcare. Where are we? Just so you know, and I'm sure you weren't aware of it, one of the major hospitals today is being forced into closure. Memorial Hospital in Pawtucket, Care New England is closing that. The for-profit entity that was going to buy it wouldn't take on the pension legacy costs. We have another pension system of St. Joseph's Hospital. It's in receivership. The receiver is actually coming on right after you. Partners is supposed to buy Care New England. That's now up in question due to the financial problems that Care New England's having. This is playing out real time in Rhode Island. And by the way, we haven't even changed Obamacare yet, really. So what's going to happen in Washington, and what's the sense you get from your peers who are healthcare experts at American about how this is going to play out across the country?
Well, I think we've seen a little bit of it playing out early this week, in that Donald Trump is going to do everything he can do without Congress to chip away at Obamacare, to make it more expensive for individuals to purchase insurance and to decrease incentives for the states to provide it. Now, today what we saw was Patty Murray and Lamar Alexander claim that they've struck a bipartisan compromise that would, at least in the short run, maintain some of the subsidies, which would make it, while Congress is trying to come up with a longer-term bipartisan solution to repeal and then replace in a better way the ACA, people can maintain the status quo. But I'm not surprised to hear what's happening in Rhode Island. I think across the country, these kinds of business decisions are now being treated as though the ACA will not continue, and as though the White House and Congress will basically remove any kind of incentive and funding. So, this is going to continue to trickle down based on hunches about what the policies will look like and the role that the government will continue to play, regardless of what kinds of bipartisan compromises are struck for the next 24 months.
Let's talk travel ban. Courts weighed in again today on travel ban. This is probably the 400th federal court action in travel ban in President Trump's 10 months in office. Where are we now on travel ban?
We're exactly where we were after the first, second, and third time that a court struck it down. I mean, this time a Hawaii court said that it is discriminatory on the basis of nationality. That's it. And so, my sense is the administration will continue to tweak. They'll go back to the drawing board. It won't look like a completely new ban, but there will be some more exceptions, and the next court will strike it down as well. Like, this is not something that Trump is ever going to be given the benefit of the doubt about, because it's just too controversial. And the way that he rolled it out in the first place demonstrated, I think, an intent that a lot of these courts are continuing to read into even kinder, gentler versions of it.
And the federal courts can look at intent. They can look at language. They can look at the narrative. They can look at tweets. They can look at speeches in interpreting.
And they can also, right, and they can also look at how these different bans have evolved, and sort of the way that the administration is simply trying to tweak or get around a criticism, and whether that's a genuine attempt to skirt the law or not.
Take us down to Washington right now. It's such a foreign, mysterious place for us who live in the rest of America. What's the tenor down there? What's the issue? Up here, we really enjoy or don't enjoy Washington via talking heads on Sundays and CNN and MSNBC and Fox during the week. Is it Russia still all the time? Is it fears about North Korea? Is it healthcare? Is it, what's got momentum down there this week?
This week I think it's been twofold. The first is whether there would actually even be enough Senate votes and enough Republicans to return to Washington to cast the kinds of votes that the Republicans need to pass tax reform. Because Thad Cochran was not in town. He just arrived back today and is apparently here. So there's a lot of that, and it seems much more nowadays than it has in the previous years been about taking attendance. Right. Because everything is so close that it's really a matter of tracking who's where. We saw this with John McCain when it came down to healthcare. We're seeing it now again. And so there's a lot of attention to the logistics and the minutia, and not as much the big picture. I think in part because both sides know that the big picture conversations are too hard. The other thing is, it really is Russia all the time, and there still are camera crews and journalists outside of the federal courthouses on a daily basis, hoping that they're going to be able to figure out which grand jurors are Muellers and which are not. And so that doesn't get a lot of national play, but that's pretty much how people down here are keeping themselves occupied.
Are you on a federal grand jury looking into the Trump administration?
I am not, but I know
Okay.
someone on a federal grand jury that is not looking into the Trump administration.
Back in the olden days of the United States Senate, when somebody was missing or somebody was sick, their colleague across the aisle who had the opposing point of view would pair with them so that neither side were impacted. So if Thad Cochran was a yes, then maybe Elizabeth Warren, who is a no, would not cast her vote. I'm guessing that that old time United States Senate behavior is long gone, hard to find.
I think that if the members of the Senate were informed of that now, it would be the biggest laugh they had all week.
Last but not least, try and give me some insight into what could be done. We have a continuing resolution and some control on spending that's going to run out in a period of time. When does that roll? When does that end? And when are we going to have the next conflict over the debt ceiling?
So it's a little bit difficult to tell. I am trying to follow this. I don't know how normal people follow it because every time I look into this, it seems like another 30 days have passed. So my understanding now, I think, is we have until October 31st, and then we can pass another continuing resolution that'll take us through the end of the year. And my sense is that both of those will pass pretty quickly and easily just because there's too much at stake, and the Republicans, who have traditionally been the ones that have been opposed, have now said, well, we have to keep the government going. You know that there's a problem when your budget director, who had always been sort of a fiscal hawk, says that he no longer cares about deficits.
Yeah, that was amazing. I think it was a week ago Sunday on the Talking Head shows that the most aggressive anti-deficit member of the United States House of Representatives, who had been always chirping about controlling deficit, then came out and said, well, don't worry about that, everything's good. If we get if we get a burp on the stock market, will that change everything?
If we get a what, I'm sorry?
If the stock market takes a hiccup, you know, we've been in this incredible period of up and to the right on the stock market. I think it's up 25% since the election. You know, everybody's 401k looks a lot better than it used to, including members of Congress. Can never count out how they're being affected. But if all of a sudden we had a couple corrections and we lost 10% off the market, lost 2,000 points in a 15-day, 20-day period, would that bring reality back to everybody, or would that not have an effect even then?
I think that might affect members of Congress a little bit. I don't think that unless we start seeing major dips in employment numbers and a real change in the unemployment rate, will we begin to see people feel like the administration is not delivering on its promises. I mean, it's somewhat ironic in that as the employment rate has gotten lower and lower and lower and more people have become employed, there hasn't been this broad sense of people feeling better about the direction the country is heading in. But my sense is that if those numbers really start to turn around and go in the negative direction, they're going to realize how good they've had it for the last few years.
Well, as always, Professor Lawless, spectacular. Thursday and Friday, we roll out John Della Volpe's polling work. He's up at the Kennedy School and the Institute of Politics up at Harvard. I can tell you this, having seen the top line, you and Kate will have a lot to talk about next Tuesday relative to some research being done